this creative dynamic tension between totality and individuality. And then as our life goes on, so if we look from, that's the scale of the whole of our life, but if we look into just the workings of it moment to moment, we see that same kind of tension going on. As a child, we get a lot of that sense of a kind of dissolved wholeness, at least maybe in an ideal or healthy childhood situation. At the mother's breast, for example, in the kind of warm parental embrace. And we may have, especially if we've kind of explored that a little bit, we may have vague or diffuse, fuzzy memories of that kind of childhood, that kind of childhood, kind of inclusion, wholeness, unity, maybe. We may have experiences at other times in our life, with a more kind of sophisticated adult psychology, of times where we felt ourselves to be somehow dissolved in a universal embrace. And some kind of spiritual or religious language talks about that in terms of universal mother. I was wrapped in the embrace of the universal mother, we might say, if we're inclined to that kind of language. Or we might say, I felt at one with life. Or we might say the sense of separation in me dissolved. And that might be in meditation, it might be sometimes contact with nature. It can be a context in which one's kind of intimacy with all of life is felt very keenly. It might be sometimes with another, in the intimate contact, sometimes in the intimacy of sexual contact. Some kind of sense of dissolution might be felt. So we have these kind of experiences and reference points wherein we recognize and we have some intuitive feel for the truth of some way in which we know ourselves to be a part of a whole, and in fact longing often for that dissolution in. It was referred to a little bit this morning. We're speaking about the possibility to abandon these demands and defenses and distractions, to let go of my habitual and familiar and all painful reactive patterns, and to know some kind of rest in life, some kind of oneness with life. And at the same time, we experience ourselves and we construct a sense of, and in fact really, really need a sense of the other end of the spectrum of being an individual. And a lot of our life is defined in terms of our individuality. Right? I am like this. Right? And even in it conceiving of I am like this, or saying I am like this, there's a way in that conceiving that we set ourselves apart from I am like this, whereas you are, like that. And so whether we define ourselves in terms of our history, in terms of our roles in life, in terms of our gender, etc., etc., as ways of giving emphasis to that individuality. And yet in an everyday sense, both of them, and because there's some essentialness to both, there's something essentially unique about our human life, and yet something essentially whole and included and non-separated about our human life. If we don't really understand, if we don't really explore that tension, then inevitably it will produce some struggle, some difficulty, some suffering. What normally happens, and again it's to explore this in your own experience, is the more we hold on to one end of the spectrum, the more we feel the lack of the other. to give some examples, the more we emphasize sense of individuality, the more we feel somehow isolated in that individuality from the rest of life. The more we feel isolated, the more we feel the lack of contact. And yet, at the same time, if we emphasize the other side, if we emphasize the contact with, which we're longing for in many ways, the possibility for closeness to, the intimacy with, quite quickly we start to, that feels threatening. Like somebody was speaking about before. Oh, what about me? So we go easily, in emphasizing the contact and connection, we feel the loss of individuality. And yet in emphasizing the individuality, we feel the loss of contact. Oh dear. We might say, well, what are we to do? Right? That's the usual tension that exists between those two places. Somehow feeling, and I admit it's a bit of a bleak, tragic view of human life, but this is the way of what the Buddha called the everyday untrained mind. Right? We don't really find our rest and completion in a sense of individuality, because we feel the lack of connection, and yet we don't really find a real rest and peace in the connection, because then we feel that something of us is getting lost. In child psychology, there's this stage that's called the rapprochement conflict. I don't know if you're familiar with that, maybe? Some of you who are in that world. And basically, and it's a very fascinating, and then you can really see toddlers doing this, where again, so it's another change of scale, right? But the same thing happening, where toddlers are first starting to develop a sense of their individualness, right? The fact that they're not just, this kind of diffuse kind of bubble of being that they seem to be when they're first born. And again, which if you kind of have maybe accessed some memory of that in your life, you might remember this rather diffuse sense. So the way this kind of creative tension plays out for a young child, a toddler, there's this sense of connection, and yet once they feel safe and secure in that connection, the need seems to be there to establish the individuality, and they'll go away from the parent, from the mother maybe, and kind of start to sense the thing of themselves. They kind of fight, push against the parent to get some kind of independence. And yet when they get a little bit far away from mum or whoever, fear, the loss of connection, and they run back to the parent, and then there's like, they embrace her, and yet quite quickly, and then the mother says, it's okay, and you take the child and comfort the child. Quite quickly, it's all right, get off, and they wiggle. And I remember this very well with my own children. And they go, all right, down, I want to get down. And they get down and they go away. And then, quite quickly, back. And so there's a kind of, it's kind of how we necessarily, it seems, as we first start to establish a sense of individualness, how we experience and explore that creative tension in our lives. And of course there may be various disruptions in our childhood. There are disruptions for all of us. They may be more or less kind of severe or even traumatizing. That mean we maybe end up on one or other end of that spectrum more. We may be somebody who more seeks out and relies on and longs for the sense of contact and inclusion, or we